2024 could be a remarkable year in many respects. The large number of elections in and outside Europe alone will make 2024 a special year. We do not know how these elections will turn out, but what we do know today is that migration will be one of the main issues, if not the main issue, in many election campaigns. So it's therefore obvious how important it is to have an accurate outlook for the 2024 migration year. What will be the most important developments? What trends can we expect? And which regions will play a special role? My name is Bernhard Schragl and I'm Head of Corporate Communications at ICMPD. Today we will be discussing the ICMPD Migration Outlook 2024. I have the great pleasure of welcoming Martin Hofmann, ICMPD's Principal Advisor and lead author of the ICMPD Migration Outlook. A very warm welcome, Martin.
Hello, Bernhard. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being with us, Martin, to discuss the Migration Outlook. This Outlook has a very special format and presentation structure. This structure was developed to make the report easy to understand for readers outside the research and outside the expert community. At the heart of this structure, there are the so-called 10 migration issues to look out for at the beginning of the Outlook report. So I first want to discuss some of these migration issues to look out for. Before we get there, let's have a look at the big picture. Last year was an outstanding year again. The European Union received over 1 million asylum applications, and we saw the highest number since 2015-16. So what's about this year? What's about 2024? What do you expect, Martin? And which are the reasons for these expectations?
Well, first of all, I think we have to conclude that since 2015, almost every year was an outstanding year. We had the refugee or so-called refugee crisis with the highest numbers of arrivals ever in the EU, which was followed then a few years later by the complete mobility crunch during the COVID time. Last year or 2 years ago, with the start of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we had the highest number of refugees accessing the territory of the European Union since the end of the Second World War. Last year, the outstanding feature was that we have again an exceptionally high number of asylum applications. End of the year figures will be more than 1 million, and also 22% increase in irregular arrivals at the external borders. This is largely to be explained by geopolitical and economic situation in the wider European neighborhood, significant increase in conflict and displacement in the regions where asylum applicants in the EU traditionally originate from. And there we have to conclude for next year that we should expect a further worsening of these situations. We should also expect a further worsening in economic terms in many regions of origin of asylum seekers in the EU. So when we speak about the potential, we don't see any reason why the so-called migration pressures at the external borders or on the asylum systems should decrease.
Of course, we know about these reasons like geopolitical reasons and growing numbers of countries in crisis. But as a migration issue to look out for number 3, you mentioned something quite particular. You talk about the so-called securitization of migration. So could you explain this term? And could you elaborate on why you consider it as a main migration issue?
The securitization of migration basically identifies a very simple fact that state policies link migration issues to security issues. See migration as a potential risk or as a threat to state security or societal security. And then the term was rather used in connection with EU migration policy in the context of the so-called externalization. Here, the allegation or the conclusion was the EU externalizes European migration control interests to other regions, border control, return, and aspects like that, again, mainly driven by security concerns. And last year we saw a remarkable number of, I would say, events and also state policies outside of Europe where governments argued exactly with this security concerns and used those security concerns as the basis for large-scale repatriation or expulsion programs. Pakistan and Iran did that in connection with Afghan migrants on the territory. Northern African countries did this with regard to sub-Saharan migrant populations on their territory. And the argument was, first of all, those are undocumented migrants, are not legally staying migrants, are not refugees, but they are a threat or risk for internal security. And hundreds of thousands of people were expelled from those countries on basis of those arguments. And that is definitely something that will also be the case this year. The governments who have implemented those programs last year already indicated that they will continue with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned now several focus regions. We will talk about this later on. So before we get there, let's move on with the main migration issues to look out for. The next point is about secondary movements as a very strong driver of migration. Can you first of all explain what secondary movement means and tell us why it will be so relevant this year?
Yeah, secondary migration, again, quite banal phenomenon with a fancy term, comes basically from the area of protection and referred to refugees that would move on from the first country that could have provided protection for them to a third country, basically. So a primary movement was interpreted as the first country providing protection, secondary movement, any other movement that would follow to a third country. Meanwhile, this term is also used for any kind of movement where migrants who have stayed in a country other than their home country, in a host country, for longer time periods now to another country. And it's hard to quantify that. It's close to impossible. We will never know exactly whether someone has stayed in another country already before when he or she show up in our statistics. But, of course, there's knowledge out there, there's analysis out there to describe that, and there's indicators. So this year, secondary movements also closely linked to the security topic I mentioned before, because as a result, we believe that, and many other analysts believe that, as a result of those expulsion and repatriation programs, many migrants have not returned home, but have tried to reach Europe from North African countries. There are indicators for that. Last year, among all arrivals in Italy via the central Mediterranean route, roughly 5% originated from sub-Saharan African countries or southern African countries. This year, it's around 40%. So those are moving figures. They change, but the trend is very clear. And everybody believes that, to a large extent, those are people who have been residing in North African countries already for some time, but due to the, meanwhile, very hostile climate in those countries, have decided to take the dangerous journey across the Mediterranean. And that is something that we will also see throughout the year in many other cases as well.
As I mentioned already in my introduction, this year we will see many democracies hold regional and national elections. And in your report, you consider migration to play a decisive role in election campaigns. So tell me, Martin, why do you think so, and what effects do you expect in course of this year?
Well, I think we just have to watch the news and to see that in most European countries, but also in many non-European countries, the migration issue is of central importance when it comes to the support of the citizens, of the electorates for the governments, or when it comes to opposition parties getting stronger. Again, this is not limited to Europe. You find this almost everywhere. Now, the degree of dissatisfaction within Europe among the populations with the governments is definitely not only influenced by migration issues. It's cost of living, It's still the aftermath of the COVID crisis. It's housing. It's access to opportunities. But the migration topic is always in the bracket of these themes, and everybody expects that right-wing parties and migration skeptic parties, to put it like this, will be strengthened in upcoming European elections, but also in other elections. So governments will try to prove to the electorates, to the citizens, that they act on migration, and particularly in the area where the populations or the citizens, voters, might have concerns, and this is irregular migration and this is asylum. So they will try to show that they can develop and implement sustainable solutions.
Yeah, and this leads directly to my next question. I would like to talk about this point about external processing of asylum, or as you call it, the asylum offshoring. This is something which has been discussed during the last years several times, and now it's under discussion again. So, as an example, in your report, you mentioned the agreement between Italy and Albania. So, can you elaborate on this example, and can you explain why this will be so relevant this year?
It is a bit of a complicated issue. To start with, externalization basically means external processing, pre-arrival processing of an asylum claim by a destination country while a protection seeker is still in another state or is moved to another state. So normally the European system works like that. You apply in Austria. Austria is responsible for your procedure. During procedure, you stay in Austria, and then you either get a positive decision, or in case of a negative decision, you should return to your home country. So this is how the system works. Externalization or offshoring basically means that the procedure is not conducted in Austria, is not conducted on the territory of the responsible state, but in another country. Initially, externalization referred to also humanitarian visa and evacuation programs. That is still in the debate, that externalization can also be for the benefit of applicants, so that they don't have to engage in a dangerous journey to get to a country where they can have their claim processed in a functioning and legal way, that this can also work from another location. But in the context of this year, in the context of your question, there's another aspect of it, and it's the deterring aspect of externalization, meaning that applicants for protection cannot enter the territory of the state that is responsible for processing their claim. And here the idea is that this will deter people from trying it in the first place. So when they want to reach Germany, but they can't, when they want to reach Italy, but they can't during procedure, but this is conducted in another country, then people will not apply in the first place. That's the notion, that's the political logic. And we could simply see from analyzing all the ideas and the more concrete initiatives that were proposed and followed throughout the last couple of years, centered around this externalization. That's the initiatives with Rwanda, Denmark, United Kingdom, many others also considered that. And now the agreement you mentioned between Italy and Albania. And we see that also many governments have started to argue in that direction. Governments that would not have done this 1 year ago. And in view of the elections that we have, I assume that this will be the main proposal, politically speaking, but also practically speaking, coming from governments throughout the year.
Now let's turn away from political campaigns and from election campaigns to a very different topic. It's about labor migration. So the headline of this point, of this migration issue to look out for, says labor migration is coming of age in 2024. So tell me, why is labor migration so important this year, and how does it come of age?
As you know, Bernhard, I'm a dry analyst with taking dry stance on those issues. So I really pondered over whether I could use coming of age as a very daring term for that. But I think so much happened, especially last year, that this term is qualified. Much more happened that I would have thought possible within a short time span. If you recall previous outlook, last year we had on labor migration as a big development in 2022, the negotiation and conclusion of migration partnerships with India, for instance, that would contain this strong labor migration component. And the conclusion was more or less between the lines. Now it will take very, very long before those political agreements are filled with life, because labor migration is so immensely complex to manage. And it still is, but so much happened over the last year that the systems of the member states' cooperation with countries of origin, intra-country cooperation, specific programs, legislation, and so on and so forth, much too much to mention even here. And it really took off, basically. So this coming of age, I think, is a justified conclusion. This year, I expect the consolidation of everything that has done before, but also that EU member states who are in more or less desperate need, meanwhile, of qualified labor will look to new regions of origin. Latin America, for instance, Malaysia, many are mentioned. We'll simply try to recruit as many as possible on the basis of the existing systems. Throughout the year, I think it will also become clear that the pool of practically and formally qualified third country nationals to come to the EU and to work here formally and legally is not sufficient. So the ideas of broadening this pool by skills partnerships, talent partnerships that bring EU training standards and also formal expectations to countries of origin will gain speed during the year. But for this year, I expect really the broadening of countries of origin Europeans will work with.
Mm-hmm. Now, we mentioned the two main narratives, as it was called in an article which was published recently. So on the one hand, there's the narrative of we need more people, we need migration. And the other narrative is we need to externalize it. So there was the European Commissioner, Johansson, mentioned about 1 million migrants which Europe needs per year. So what do you think about this number of 1 million? Is it a correct number? Is it just a fancy number? Or what is your assessment of this number?
Well, 1 million is always a fancy number and nice to quote. I think looking at demographic developments and really the rather fast shrinking of the labor force within the EU, I think it's not exaggerated, 1 million. But it's also, we move here in the margins of what really makes a difference also on the labor markets. In the long run, it will be difficult to reach the 1 million because, as I've said before, you need them with the right skills and qualifications so that they can really take up formal employment. Trade-off between irregular migration and legal and labor migration is not really possible. It's simply two different categories. So at the political level, very much so. So when you manage to get into good negotiations and agreements with countries of origin, then it makes a lot of sense to link those two in the framework of intelligent agreements and policies. But it's an obvious thing when you need qualified staff for the health sector, which is the major issue at the moment, then asylum seekers lacking the language skills, the formal skills, the education, there will be no trade-off between these two groups of people. So this is the reality that is extremely difficult, I think, also for governments and for political parties to communicate to not only the voters, but also to the economic sector. Why do we have to keep these two strands of migration strictly apart? Isn't that counterintuitive? Well, it isn't in reality. Notwithstanding that, there will also be, I think, we will see more openings for asylum seekers to enter the labor market during procedure. In case of a positive decision, they have anyhow almost full access in a limited way, and for selected, would say, nationalities of origin will be widened, but definitely not for all and not in an unlimited way, at least not next year.
Talking about labor migration, let's also discuss the biggest group of refugees Europe has faced since the Second World War. Let's talk about refugees from Ukraine. The Russian invasion started now already 2 years ago, and now we have more than 4 million of refugees in Europe. So what's about their integration in general, and what's about their integration particularly in the labor market? You mentioned some quite interesting numbers. In some countries, European countries, just 17% of them are in formal employment. In some other countries, 77% of them are in formal employment. So how would you explain this huge gap, and what's the situation in general?
First of all, we have to travel back maybe to the time when the decision was taken that for the first time in history to grant to country of origin, to a nationality, temporary protection in the EU. This implied there will be there is no assessment of the individual case. The fact that someone is from Ukraine more or less is enough to become beneficiary of temporary protection, maximum duration 3 years. And linked to that was also immediate access to the labor market. Now, the expectation at the time sometimes was that since Ukrainians, overwhelmingly, we talk about young women in this case, who came and would be available for the labor market, have high degrees of education and qualification. They have now legally direct access to the labor market. So the labor market outcomes will be a lot better than in comparison to other refugee populations in the EU. And that was only partly the case. We have expected it, I have to say, because there's many other hindrances for someone to enter the labor market. Economic reasons, you have to, especially when you're a refugee, find your feet again in a completely new environment. You had no preparation for that. There are no social networks and so on and so forth. So the question is now, when we look at the figures 2 years into temporary protection in the EU for Ukrainians, principally their outcomes are better than for other groups. This is true, but not as good as they were expected. Now, there are huge differences between the member states. First and foremost, we have to underline that the methods or the basis for computing those figures are fairly different in different countries. Some countries have counted every Ukrainian taking up employment with an employer. So if this was the case 3 times per year, so there's three entries and so on and so forth. For other countries, there's underreporting because they don't take part-time employment or employment that is very limited into the statistics. Still, there is a big difference between the member states, and this has a lot to do with is there sectorial protection, as you might want to call it, for instance, in the health sector. Are people really in a position to enter this? Are there other hindrances that prevent them from doing so? Another question is what the promotion, what the integration programs are like. Are they designed in a way that they foster employment or not? Access to social and welfare benefits. Is this limited to people who do not work, or can they also receive those benefits when they are in employment and the income is very low. So there's many small levers and ways to influence this in one way or the other. I think taking into account the huge need we have on our labor markets, and now that we move into the third year of temporary protection, governments can do more and better on promoting the integration and also the economic integration of the Ukrainian beneficiaries of temporary protection in the EU, and they should do that next year, hopefully.
Okay, so you want to tell us a number? What do you consider as a valid goal?
I think it could be possible to lift it very clearly on an average above 50% across the EU, as difficult as this may be to achieve, but also to then really compare the figures between countries. And taking into account where the biggest need is, and that we have such high levels of basic formal education and training for the people we talk about, I think the health sector should be the priority area as regards opening, but also as regards very targeted integration and promotion programs by states.
Okay, so now we discussed the 10 migration issues to look out for in this year. Let's now switch to another and turn to another chapter. It's a quite comprehensive chapter, and this is in fact the chapter I'm always the most wondering about every year. It's the one about migration trends. Here again, you have succeeded in focusing on the main trends of the year. So can you share your assessment of the key migration trends with us?
I think first of all is, why do we look at those? And the reason is exactly related to like the first question or the first aspects we have discussed. 1 million this, 1 million that. But the 1 million consists of many different underflows and different situations and different developments that lead to this global number. And it's also important and always worthwhile to look exactly at the broken down trends. What happened with important countries of origin of asylum seekers the last year? How did they develop? What is the share of certain regions among this whole group of applicants? Do we see the impact of policy changes? So those are the main questions. Of course, again, we don't look enough at the area of labor migration, also because we don't have the figures. But when we consider what is really the center of the debate and the center of policies, then it is, like always, asylum and irregular arrivals. And here we see a few interesting developments. First, one that puts a bit into question also this policy focus on externalization that we have discussed before with regard to will this deter people from coming. So there's, again, the clear link between conflict and the numbers of asylum seekers, whether they increase or not. So Syria, for instance, we see as the most prominent country of origin, again with an increase, and this we can link also to the security situation in Syria and also the situation in the main host countries of Syrians in the neighborhood. We see indicators for the secondary movements I've explained before, increase of applications and arrivals from nationals from sub-Saharan countries. Again, we should stress that all in all, the share of asylum seekers from sub-Saharan African countries is comparatively low. I think it's 50 nations that are considered sub-Saharan African, whether you like the term or not. And the number of asylum seekers coming from those countries is more or less equal to the number of asylum seekers coming from Syria alone. So it's overrated, but it's increasing also, as we think, because of secondary movements. And the third interesting finding, I think, last year was the impact of policy changes on the numbers of certain nationalities. In 2022, many asylum seekers came from countries of origin with very low recognition rates in the EU, but with visa-free access to neighboring countries. That was changed, and we see really a massive drop in arrivals, in detections, and in asylum applications. When it comes to the detections of irregular crossing on the Western Balkan route, the figures related to India and Tunisia dropped by almost 100% after the policy change. So this also gives you indications for whether certain changes in policy have an impact or not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for these 3 key trends of the migration year 2024. The biggest chapter of the migration outlook is about focus regions. And you mentioned already Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So please tell us, what do you mean by a focus region? First of all, let's discuss this term. What does focus region mean? And which focus regions would you mention as relevant for this year?
Well, focus region is basically seen from the perspective of, again, what drives the debate the most in the EU and Europe, and this is asylum applications, and this is irregular arrivals. And then we try to have a very, very broad and very generic look at the situation in the countries and regions where the majority of asylum seekers in the EU come from. So here, unfortunately, not very good news, not for last year, not for this year, that in most of the relevant regions the situation has not improved security-wise, economically, and also with regard to the readiness in host countries of large numbers of refugees in important regions to continue hosting them in such large numbers. This, for instance, refers to Syrians, neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, also Jordan, all think very loudly about returning Syrians to their home country, which is economically in a very bad situation still when it comes to access to basic service, healthcare, education, you name it, and a catastrophic situation for many returnees. So they might feel prompted to move on towards Europe, and I think the quantitative developments of last year confirmed that. So also policy changes I have mentioned already. Also, I think last year we saw really an impact also of natural disasters then on the stance within important host countries, Libya, other North African countries, also Pakistan still suffering from the enormous impact of the floods. Also came to the conclusion to say, well, the economic pressures and the hardships on our own population are so big, we cannot cater for such large populations of undocumented migrants. That was also a trend we saw in several regions. And like always, Latin American countries of origin are very important when it comes to asylum statistics. That is not discussed very often in the European context, but it's a fact. And also here we see also really a substantial worsening of the situation in many of those countries. Many of those displaced in those countries try to reach the US. So they are in a similar situation as Europe, also a very polarized and emotional discussion on migration, but also the movements towards Europe, mainly Spain, increase or stay at high levels because of that. So it's worthwhile to look at the many regions or countries of origin that are relevant for our debate. And as you know, the list seems to get longer every year. Gaza is in very early stages from a migration perspective, but almost everybody in Gaza or in the Gaza Strip is displaced. 85-90% of the houses are damaged by now. These people have no place to go, also don't want to leave in order not to lose their state, basically. So this is also a situation that will develop in terms of migration this year, but it's hard or almost impossible to tell what the dynamics will be exactly. But as I said, the list gets longer every year.
So thanks for this overview of the focus regions which will influence migration this year. You mentioned the US already, but of course, since this is a year including the US presidential elections, so what can you imagine? Which influence can the elections have on migration flows to Europe, on Latin America, first of all, and then on migration flows to Europe?
Well, although all the European elections will be important, of course, for Europe, this might be the most important election also from a European perspective. First of all, something we have not mentioned thus far is the ever closer relation between migration and geopolitics that we find many instances for. The instrumentalization we have seen in previous years that also continued this year. Cooperation with in Africa, where military coups have taken place, where's the big question, can you continue on this? The Western and European influence is diminishing on the African continent. We're losing friends there. So what does that imply for cooperation on migration? And now we have the US election, where this year, just like last year, the Republicans in Congress tie their approval of another aid package for Ukraine, but also for Taiwan and Israel, including military aid, to much more strict tightening of migration policy. So you see that the migration topic is now influencing most probably the most important geopolitical decision of this year. So if the US support for Ukraine is not there anymore, what might this imply for the future of the conflict there? And in the case that Ukraine loses, what would that imply migration-wise? Last year we had a scenario where we said if the situation in Ukraine really worsens, Europe has to be prepared for an additional 4 million refugees, and this holds true for this year as well. So the development that is linked to, you can say, a political conflict in the US, also over who has a better starting position for the elections in autumn, closely linked to migration, but might have very serious outcomes, not just on migration for Europe.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this impressive and insightful overview and discussion. We talked about the 10 migration issues to look out for, we talked about the main trends, and we talked about the focus regions of this migration year. So before we finish, I would like to make a more personal comment. It's now 7 years since the two of us developed the ICMPD Migration Outlook together, and the impetus for this was basically the large number of inquiries we got from international correspondents, and they kept approaching us with one and the same question: can you provide us with an overview of what will happen with regards to migration? What trends do we have to expect, and where do we have to take a closer look? And in response to these inquiries, the both of us, we then designed the ICMPD Migration Outlook together. And what I want to underscore now is, of course, the centerpiece of this outlook. The content was and is written by you, Martin, and we all appreciate that very, very much. Thank you. I am Bernhard Schragl, ICMPD Head of Corporate Communications, and I look forward to welcoming you to the next ICMPD Migration podcast soon. For more insights and expert talks on migration, subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media. Thank you for tuning in.